The application on Ambrose Stillman's desk belonged to a 71-year-old woman who needed $11 an hour to keep her grandson fed. Ambrose owned a freight empire and a glass tower in downtown Asheville with his name bolted across the top. A man like him should never have seen a cleaner's paperwork at all. But his chief operating officer had flagged it for rejection over the woman's age, and when Ambrose glanced down to sign off, his eyes caught the first name at the top of the page, and every drop of blood in his body turned to ice. Tilda. He had hated that name for 50 years. It was stitched in red thread into the corner of the blanket he was found in, hours old, blue from the cold, abandoned in a basement laundry room. His whole life, he believed that name belonged to the mother who threw him away like garbage. That same morning, Tilda Renfrow was on her knees on a bathroom floor in West Asheville, wiping up a ceiling leak and counting coins out of a peanut butter jar so her 10-year-old grandson could go on a school field trip. She needed that job more than she had needed anything in years. And while she counted nickels for a child's museum ticket, a billionaire in the top floor office of that tower was staring at her first name like it had crawled out of his worst memory. So he hired her that same afternoon. Not to help her, not out of kindness. He hired her so he could watch her, test her, trap her, and finally make the woman he had hated his whole life pay for what she did to him. He was wrong about her in a bigger way than any man has ever been wrong about anyone. 6 weeks later, the truth would put him on his knees on the porch of that same duplex, begging a poor grandmother to forgive him. To understand what Ambrose did to Tilda Renfrow, you have to know what those 5 stitched letters had already done to him. He was 9 the first time a caseworker slid his own file across a folding table, and he read the words that would build the rest of his life. Newborn male. Found January 1976, St. Genevieve's Hospital. Basement laundry area. Wrapped in a wool blanket with the name Tilda stitched into the corner. Mother never identified. No relatives located. Nobody ever came for him. He went through 7 foster homes in 14 years, and he kept the blanket through every one. At night, when he was small, he would run his thumb over the red stitching and imagine the woman who wrote her name on him, and then walked away. By 12, he had stopped imagining her with love. He imagined her so he would have something to hate. That hate turned out to be excellent fuel. He aged out at 18 with $200 loaded trucks and slept in an unheated cab through 2 winters. By 50, Stillman Freight moved cargo through every state east of the Mississippi, and Ambrose Stillman was worth just under $3 billion. He never married, never had children, and fired people over a single mistake without losing a minute of sleep. The business magazines called him the coldest man in North Carolina, and he framed the article, "Cold men don't get abandoned twice." The blanket sat in a fireproof safe behind his desk. He had not opened that safe in 11 years. He didn't need to. The name was stitched somewhere deeper than wool. Then, on a gray Tuesday in October, Verena Slocum walked into his office with a stack of paperwork, and hate got handed its opportunity. Verena was his chief operating officer, sharp as a scalpel and twice as clean. She ran his tower like a machine and trusted no one. She dropped the stack on his desk and tapped the top page with one manicured finger. Facilities wants to hire this for the executive floors. Her voice carried the tone she used for spoiled freight. 71 years old, Ambrose. Night shift, the whole executive tower. She falls. She breaks a hip, and her lawyer owns our lobby. I need your signature to override it. Ambrose barely heard her. He was already reading the name. Tilda Renfrow. Age 71. West Asheville. The room tilted. 50 years of red thread pulled tight around his chest, and for a moment he was 9 again, reading a file that said nobody ever came. His face gave her nothing, because he had spent a lifetime learning how. Then he said the words that made Verena's mouth fall open. Hire her. To night shift. My floor. Verena blinked like he had started speaking backwards. She argued liability, insurance, and the absurdity of a CEO personally hiring a mop pusher, and Ambrose looked up with eyes so flat and strange that she stopped mid-sentence. I said hire her. He signed the override without reading it. And Verena, I want her background file on my desk by Friday. Everything. Every job she's ever held, going back 50 years. Verena picked up the sign page and studied him, and something in her chest tightened. In 11 years, she had never once seen Ambrose Steelman interested in a human being. She did not care who the old woman was. She cared what Ambrose might become if a cleaner made him human. Because a soft man rewrites his will and his loyalties, and Verena had built her whole future on a hard one. Interested things were unpredictable, and unpredictable things were threats. She smiled with her mouth only and walked out. And across the city, a 71-year-old woman got the phone call that would tear open a 50-year-old secret and had no idea. She just pressed the phone to her chest and thanked God, because rent was 9 days late and her grandson needed new shoes. Her name was Tilda Renfrow. And if you have ever been judged for something you never did, type the words "I've been there" in the comments right now, because what this billionaire was about to do to this grandmother will make your blood boil, and the truth underneath, it will break your heart. Her grandson Judson was 10, and his class was going to the Science Museum in the spring, and Tilda had promised him he was going even if she had to carry that bus on her back. Judson had lived with her for 4 years, since her daughter Renee died of an infection a hospital caught 2 days too late. Tilda buried her only child on a Thursday, moved a race car bed into her sewing room on Friday, and never once let that boy see her cry. Grief was a night shift she worked alone. She had cleaned things her entire life. Laundromats, a mill until it closed, 22 years of office buildings. Her knees sounded like gravel in a coffee can. But her work was flawless, and she carried a corner-by-corner pride in it that no one had ever paid her enough for. When the call came offering the job, night shift, executive floors, starting Monday, Tilda hung up and did a small shuffling dance on the linoleum, and Judson laughed so hard he got hiccups. She had no idea she had just been hired by a man who believed she threw him away in a basement 50 years ago, or that she was walking into a trap with her name stitched all the way through it. Her first night, a supervisor handed her a cart, a badge, and a map of the executive floor, the big man's own office. Most cleaners worked in teams of 3. Tilda was assigned alone. Nothing that happened to her in that building for 6 weeks was an accident. Ambrose stayed late her first night, behind the glass wall of a darkened conference room, watching an old woman push a cart through his kingdom like an examiner grading a lie. He watched her get down on both knees, joints cracking loud enough to hear through the glass, to peel a flattened sticker off the marble when nobody was watching. She did it anyway. He told himself guilty people are thorough people, and lay awake till dawn with the old red stitching burning behind his eyes like a brand. On her third night, he set the first trap. He took $300 from his own money clip, folded it inside a torn envelope, and dropped it into the wastebasket beside his desk, half buried under printer paper. A poor woman, alone at night, money in the trash, and nobody on earth would ever know. He went home to wait for proof that Tilda Renfrow was exactly who he needed her to be. At 6:04 the next morning, his head of security called him, confused. The night cleaner had turned in the cash with a handwritten note. Found in the top floor wastebasket. Please check if somebody threw this away by mistake. People make mistakes when they're tired. God bless. T. Renfrow. Ambrose read that note 11 times. He wanted it to be a performance. He needed it to be a performance. He crushed the note in his fist and told security to log the cash and say nothing. 1 week later, he escalated. He left his wristwatch on the edge of the executive washroom sink, a Swiss piece worth $62,000, alone on white porcelain at midnight with no camera in the room. She could slip it into her apron, and no jury in the country could prove she ever saw it. At 4:40 in the morning, a security guard found Tilda in a plastic chair she had dragged outside the washroom, half asleep, both hands folded over the watch in her lap. Her shift had ended at 4. She had stayed 40 minutes unpaid. You don't leave a thing like this sitting by a sink, baby, she told the guard. And you don't carry a rich man's watch in your pocket either. Or somebody looks at an old cleaning woman and thinks the worst. So I just sat with it. When Ambrose heard that, he did something he had not done in 11 years. He opened the safe, took out the blanket, laid it under the desk lamp, and looked at the red stitching that had run his whole life. Every trap she passed did not soften him. It enraged him. If she was a thief, then abandoning a baby is what a bad woman does. His whole life made sense. But if she was good alone in the dark when no one was watching, Then she had looked at newborn Ambrose and decided he was the one thing not worth keeping. Her goodness didn't argue with his hate. It sharpened it. He folded the blanket back into the safe, sat at his keyboard, and typed one short email to facilities. Then he stopped setting traps and started making her body pay. He doubled her floors, then added the executive gym a whole team used to clean. Across town, the cost of that email landed on a duplex kitchen. Tilda came home at 5 in the morning with her knees screaming and lowered her feet into a stock pot of Epsom salt while Judson slept down the hall. She started taking the 4:50 bus with a cane on rainy days. She told Judson it was for style, and he told her she looked like a wizard, and she laughed until her side hurt. Then she counted the peanut butter jar again, because the trip was $50 and the jar was stuck at 12. She never filed one complaint, because complaints are for people who can afford to lose jobs. Upstairs, one person in that tower was watching all of it with growing horror, and her name was Mabry Coyle. Mabry was 29, Ambrose's executive assistant, and she noticed everything because noticing was her whole job. She noticed her boss staying late on nights he had no reason to, and workload orders coming from his private email. One morning she walked in early and found the coldest man in North Carolina at his window, turning a crumpled handwritten note over in his fingers like evidence in a murder. She caught the words "God bless" before he shoved it in a drawer. Mabry poured his coffee, set it down, and did the bravest thing anyone in that building had done in years. She asked a direct question. "Sir, what is happening with the new night cleaner?" Ambrose didn't turn around. "Watch the door, Mabry." "Not me." "Sir, she's 71. Whatever this is, she's going to end up in a hospital." The word hospital moved through him like a blade. He dismissed her with 2 fingers, and Mabry walked out with her jaw tight. And that was the morning she started keeping records of her own, because she knew a slow-motion punishment when she saw one. She just could not figure out what a grandmother with a mop could possibly have done to a billionaire. Nobody could have figured it out. The answer was 50 years old, wrapped in wool, locked in a safe 10 feet from where Ambrose drank his coffee every morning. In her 4th week, Ambrose did the cruelest thing yet, and he did it in front of an audience. His founder's award, a heavy crystal plaque from the governor, vanished from the shelf outside his office overnight. By 8:30 the next morning, he had summoned security, 2 floor managers, and half the executive staff into the top floor lobby, and ordered the night cleaner held over. Tilda stood on that marble floor in her work sneakers and apron for hours past the end of her shift, surrounded by suits, while the most powerful man in the building pointed at an empty shelf. One person had access to this floor last night. His voice was courtroom calm. One person alone for 8 hours. So before this becomes a police matter, I'm giving you one chance to return what's missing. Every eye in that lobby turned to the old woman. Tilda's hands were shaking, not her voice. She set her badge and her bag on the floor in front of everyone and stepped back from them. "Search the bag, sir. Search my locker. Search my coat." She looked him dead in the eyes, and hers were wet and unashamed. "I have been poor for 71 years, Mr. Steelman. Poor when the mill closed. Poor when I buried my daughter. Poor right now, standing here. And in all that time, I never took one thing that wasn't mine. You can empty my whole life out on this pretty floor if you want. There's nothing in it but work." Nobody moved. Somewhere in the back, a young analyst tilted his phone up and started recording, because whatever this was, it wasn't normal. Security searched the bag. Cough drops, a bus pass, a folded church program, a paperback, and a peanut butter sandwich in a bread bag. No plaque. 20 minutes later, a facilities man found the Crystal Award in a supply closet 1 floor down, where nobody remembered moving it, because the person who moved it was standing in the lobby in a $9,000 suit, watching an innocent woman get searched like a criminal. Ambrose looked at the recovered plaque, then at Tilda, and gave her 4 words and no apology. "Back to work, then." He walked into his office, closed the door, and slid down the wall like a man who had been shot. He had just watched her offer up everything she owned in the world, and it fit inside 1 canvas bag, and none of it was stolen, and all of it smelled like peanut butter, and he hated her, and he was no longer sure the person he hated was her. Mabry Coyle stood in the emptying lobby, looked at the analyst's phone, and told him to send her that video. Just in case. And Tilda pushed her cart back to the elevator with her chin up. And when the doors closed and she was finally alone in that steel box, she covered her mouth with both hands and let herself shake for exactly one floor. Then she wiped her face because Judson still needed shoes and shame has never once paid a light bill. She thought she had it hidden by the time she got home. She didn't. Judson was at the table with his homework and he watched her hang up her coat and he saw her hands were still trembling around the buttons. "Grandma, why are your hands shaking?" "Bus was cold, baby. That's all." She turned to the sink so he couldn't see her face. He said nothing for a moment. Then she heard the scrape of glass on wood. And when she turned back, the boy had pushed the peanut butter jar of coins across the table toward her, the whole field trip fund. $12 he had watched her guard for months. "We don't have to go to the museum," he said. "If you need the money, I don't mind. I really don't." Tilda stood at that sink and held onto the edge of it, because a 10-year-old had just offered up the one thing he wanted in the world, so his grandmother wouldn't have to hurt for it. And that was very nearly the thing that broke her when a billionaire's whole tower had not. She came and knelt at his chair and told him the trip was happening, that some things a grandmother does not let go of, and she pushed the jar back where it belonged. Then she went to work the next night anyway, because that is what she was all the way down. That night she called her oldest friend, a retired nurse named Faylene Odom. "I almost quit today, Faye." Faylene was 80, sounded like gravel and honey, and had known Tilda for half a century. She listened to the whole story. Rich man puts a poor woman on trial in a lobby. Lord, you remember what I told you the night they walked you out of St. Genevieve's? You told me the truth doesn't rot. Tilda closed her eyes. "It just waits. It just waits," Faylene repeated. "Go to bed, Tildy. Hold that name. St. Genevieve's." 3 nights later, it landed on that top floor like a struck match. Ambrose had taken to working past midnight, so his obsession had somewhere to sit. Tilda cleaned around him, and against both their wills they had started to talk. She was impossible to hate up close, which is exactly why he kept his desk between them like a barricade. One night, watching her disinfect the glass along his bookshelves in tight, practice strokes, he heard himself ask where she learned to clean like that. Hospital work. She smiled at the old memory before she could stop herself. "My first real job. Nights at old St. Genevieve's, up on the hill. They trained us like surgeons back then. Every room the same. Every corner the same." She shook her head fondly. "A lifetime ago. I wasn't but 21. Her bottle of window cleaner kept spraying. The world Ambrose stood and did not survive the sentence. St. Genevieve's. Nights. 50 years ago. Her name in red thread in a basement. Every court in his mind slammed its gavel at once. There it was after 50 years from her own smiling mouth. She was there. He muttered something about a call, walked into the washroom, and gripped the sink until his knuckles went white. And the man in the mirror had waited his whole life to feel triumphant in this moment, and instead felt the ground opening under him. A small voice he had been strangling for weeks whispered the question that would not die. "If she threw you away in that basement, why does she sit up unpaid guarding a rich man's watch? Something is wrong with your story, Ambrose." He drowned the voice and chose the hate. It was 50 years old and it was all he had ever owned, and men protect what they own. If you're feeling this story, do me one favor and hit that subscribe button, because you are about to watch a woman with nothing face down the 2 most powerful people in that tower, and you do not want to miss how it ends. The next morning, he called Verena Slocum into his office and handed a loaded gun to the most dangerous person in the building. "That background file. Where is it?" Verena Slocum had not been idle. Verena Slocum was never idle. For 4 weeks, she had watched her boss unravel over a cleaning woman, and unravel was bad for business. So she did what she always did with a threat. She hired a private investigator with flexible ethics, paid in cash, told to find everything on Tilda Renfrow going back to the flood. Most of the dossier was the paper trail of a poor life. Rent, buses, a daughter's death certificate. But near the bottom, photocopied from a defunct hospital's archived personnel records that no investigator should have been able to touch, sat a 50-year-old termination file with a phrase in it that made Verena Slocum smile like a woman holding a winning ticket. Terminated for cause. Endangerment of a patient. Newborn male. She didn't read past the summary page. Why would she? She had the two words that kill. Endangerment. Newborn. The saint of the executive floor had been fired half a century ago for endangering a baby, and Verena intended to be standing next to the body looking helpful. She chose her moment like a sniper. Friday morning, quarterly leadership meeting, 11 executives around the long table, Ambrose at the head. Tilda had been held over yet again on his orders, restocking the credenza with coffee and glasses, invisible as cleaners are trained to be. Verena stood, tablet in hand, wearing the tone of a woman performing reluctant duty. Before we continue, I have a personnel security matter I'm required to raise. She let her eyes rest on the old woman by the credenza just long enough that everyone else's followed. An employee with unsupervised nightly access to this floor was terminated from a previous position. She swiped the tablet, savoring it, for endangering a patient, a newborn baby. There is a police report. The room went silent enough to hear the ventilation. Given that Mr. Stillman personally overrode my objection to this hire, Verena continued, sliding the knife into two backs at once, I felt the leadership team deserved transparency. Security will escort her out this morning. 2 uniformed guards were already at the door. That detail told everyone this was an execution, not a discussion. Every head turned to the credenza, to a 71-year-old woman holding a tray of clean glasses, and 11 strangers watched 50 years of buried grief surface in real time. Tilda didn't argue. That was the part none of them ever forgot. She set the tray down before her hands could drop it, stood very straight in her apron, and looked across all that mahogany at Verena Slocum with an expression that was not shame at all, and every person in that room felt the temperature of it. You went and dug up St. Genevieve's. Her voice cracked once, then found its footing. 50 years, and you put it on your little screen like you know what it says. You don't know what it says. You know what it cost. She untied her apron with shaking hands and laid it on the credenza like a folded flag. I'll walk myself out. I've been walked out before. But you hear me on one thing, ma'am, and then I'm gone. She picked up her canvas bag, and at the door, between the 2 guards, she turned around, and what she said next detonated in the middle of Ambrose Stillman's chest. That baby lived. Whatever your paper says about me, that baby lived. And that was worth the whole rest of my life. The doors closed behind her. The meeting never recovered. Ambrose sat like a man encased in glass while a 50-year-old story screamed apart inside his skull. Endangerment reports do not come with sentences like that. Mothers who dump babies in basements do not talk about them like miracles that cost everything. He shut the meeting down mid-sentence and told Mabry Coyle to bring him Verena's full dossier. Every page. In 10 minutes or start clearing her desk. Mabry brought it in 8. Set the lobby video from the plaque mourning on top of the folder without being asked, and said the second bravest thing of her career. Read all of it, sir. Not just the page that agrees with you. He read all of it alone, with the city going dark outside his windows, and the paper shook so hard the words blurred. Verena had never opened the file past its summary page. Ambrose read every word. Internal report, St. Genevieve's Hospital, January 1976. Housekeeping employee T. Renfrow, age 21, night shift, discovered an abandoned newborn male in the basement laundry room at approximately 3 a.m. Infant hypothermic, unresponsive. Employee wrapped the infant in a wool blanket from her own belongings and ran him to the 3rd floor nursery, bypassing protocol. A physician's note was appended in a fast slanted hand. Another 20 minutes in that basement, and this child is dead. The cleaner is the reason he isn't. Ambrose stopped breathing at the word blanket. Her blanket. The blanket was hers. The report kept going, and it got more beautiful and more terrible with every line, and he had to read it in pieces, like a man drinking something scalding. The infant remained unclaimed and under policy. Unclaimed infants were identified by case number. Over the following 6 weeks, employee Renfrow was observed repeatedly entering the nursery outside her assigned duties, on breaks and after shifts, to hold case 7716B, who nursing staff reported was failing to thrive and was rarely held otherwise. Employee was warned twice. Employee stated, quote, "A baby can't be a number. Somebody has to belong to him." And then the line that broke the coldest man in North Carolina in half at his own desk. Employee subsequently stitched her own first name into the infant's blanket, stating she had nothing else to give him, and that a name was better than a number until his real one came along. She was found at 4 a.m. in the nursery rocking chair, asleep, holding the infant, in her 6th week of doing so. Terminated for cause, endangerment of a patient, escorted from the premises. A misdemeanor charge was filed by an administrator and later dropped. Employee was flagged in the State Hospital Association registry and rendered unemployable in any medical facility thereafter. 50 years of hatred, aimed with a rifle's precision at the only person on earth who had loved him for free. Tilda was never his mother's name. It was the name of the woman who saved him. The woman he had spent 50 years hating. The woman he had spent 6 weeks punishing. She had run up 3 floors with a dying stranger's baby inside her own blanket, and then given that baby the only thing she owned outright, her name, and then lost her career, her pension, and 50 years of better wages for the crime of holding him at 3 in the morning so he wouldn't die alone and untouched. His mother had given him nothing, not even a name. The cleaner gave him hers, and every trap he had set for her had caught him instead. Ambrose crossed to the safe and took out the blanket, and this time he tried to touch the red stitching with one finger, and his hand shook too badly to land on it. And that was when his own cruelty started playing back behind his eyes, one frame at a time, and he could not stop it. The envelope of cash and her note. People make mistakes when they're tired. The watch, and the plastic chair she dragged into a hallway so she could guard it unpaid. Her knees cracking on his marble floor at midnight. The lobby, the suits, her canvas bag emptied onto the ground in front of a crowd. The peanut butter sandwich in a bread bag, her wet eyes that would not drop, and his own voice, for flat words, giving her nothing. Back to work, then. He had done all of it to the one woman who ran up 3 flights of stairs to keep him alive, and not one piece of it had been an accident. He had planned every trap, signed every order, chosen every cruelty with his eyes open, and told himself she deserved it. Ambrose made it to the washroom before he was sick. Then he sat on the marble floor of his own executive suite, a 50-year-old man holding a photocopy like a newborn, crying in a place with no cameras, in the same building where an old woman had cried in an elevator for exactly 1 floor, because that was all the time either of them had ever been given for it. He drove to Failing Odom's house that same night, because her name was on the report as the nursery witness, and an 80-year-old retired nurse opened her door to find a billionaire on her porch holding a wool blanket with red stitching in the corner. Failing looked at the blanket, then at his face, and her hand went to her mouth. "Baby Tilda," she whispered. "Lord have mercy. That's what we called you on the floor. She'd come up at 3 in the morning still smelling like bleach and hold you till you started gaining weight. You were dying of being nobody's son. She fixed that." Failing gripped the doorframe. They took her badge and her whole future for it, and she never fought it. 50 years, and every January she'd call me and say, "I wonder how big he is now." 50 Januaries. Ambrose stood on that porch and could not speak at all. At 7 the next morning, a black car parked outside the duplex on Emma Road, and Tilda Renfrow opened her door in her housecoat to find the man who had humiliated her standing on her step, unshaven, wrecked, holding a folded wool blanket like an offering. She recognized the stitching before she recognized what it meant. Her own red thread, her own uneven letters 5 decades old. Her knees buckled, he caught her arm, and the two of them stood in that doorway holding each other up. "It was you." Her voice came out in pieces. "The basement baby, all this time, you're my basement baby. You should hate me." He was crying in front of another human being for the first time in his adult life. "I found your name on that blanket and spent 50 years hating it. I thought you were her. I thought you left me down there. The traps, the floors, the lobby, I did all of it on purpose because I thought you were the one who threw me away." He went down, a $3 billion man kneeling on a rented porch in front of the whole waking street. "You gave me your name, and I turned it into a weapon and pointed it at you. I am begging you to forgive me." Judson watched from the hallway in his pajamas. His grandmother did not answer right away. She looked at the blanket in the stranger's hands. She looked at his wrecked face. She looked at the boy in the doorway. And the street held its breath through all of it. Then she lowered herself down to the kneeling man and took his face in her aching hands. "I forgave the baby they left in that basement a long time ago," she said. "Before I ever knew your name, before I knew you lived, I forgave that. You don't owe me one thing for the abandoned child. That was never yours." Her thumbs moved against his jaw. "But the grown man who searched my bag in front of a crowd, who put my knees on his floor at midnight and knew what he was doing, that man has some repairing to do. Not with money. With his own 2 hands, the same way I raised this boy. You understand me?" "Yes, ma'am," he whispered. "Then get up off my porch. You look half-starved." She pulled him to his feet by the hands. 50 years I prayed that basement baby was alive somewhere. I am not going to waste one single minute being angry at the answer to my prayers. And she made the coldest man in North Carolina scrambled eggs, while a 10-year-old asked if his car had a television in it. The reckoning upstairs was less gentle. The investigation found Verina's dossier was built on illegally accessed sealed records, paid for in cash, and deployed in front of 11 witnesses to destroy an innocent woman. The board terminated her for cause within the month, and the woman who weaponized a 50-year-old termination file learned what Tilda learned at 21, that a termination follows you. Except Verina's was earned. Tilda refused the check, waved it off at her own stove like a bad smell. So Ambrose stopped writing checks and did what she actually asked for. He started with the lobby. On a Monday morning, he gathered the same staff who had watched her bag get emptied onto the floor. The floor managers, the security team, the executives, the young analyst with the phone, into the top floor lobby where he had broken her in public. Verina was already gone by then, terminated for cause, and Mabry Coyle, the one person who had told the truth from the start, now stood in the exact spot where Verina used to run the room. Ambrose stepped onto the spot where he had pointed at an empty shelf, and he did the thing powerful men never do. He told the truth about himself, out loud, to everyone who had watched. 5 weeks ago, I stood right here and accused an innocent woman of stealing because I was too proud to question my own pain. I searched her in front of you. I doubled her floors until her knees gave out. I want to be clear about something. It was not a misunderstanding. I did all of it on purpose, and I knew what I was doing every single time. He let that sit. Her name is Tilda Renfrow. 50 years ago, she saved a dying baby in a hospital basement and lost everything she had for it, and that baby grew up to be me. I owe her a debt I will be paying for the rest of my life, and I wanted every one of you who watch me shame her to watch me say so. Because the story publicly broke her dignity, he made sure it publicly gave it back. That was the part she cared about. The rest, she let him handle. Her pension was restored through a settlement with the Hospital Association, 50 years late, with interest. Judson's education was funded to the last degree he could ever want. And when Stillman Freight built its children's medical foundation on the hill where St. Genevieve's used to stand, the name over the door, cut in granite, read the Tilda Renfrow wing. So the name they once escorted out of that hospital would outlive everyone who watched it happen. The blanket hangs framed in his office now, red stitching out where the safe used to hide it. When people ask him about it, Ambrose Steelman, the coldest man in North Carolina, says the same thing every time. That's my mother's name. She found me at work. And every Sunday, a black car parks on Emma Road, and a billionaire eats pot roast in a duplex kitchen, and a boy tells him about the museum, and an old woman looks down the table at the baby she named in the dark 50 years ago. Home at last. So now I need to hear from you, because this one splits the room every time. Tilda forgave the abandoned baby, but she told the grown man he still had repairing to do for what he put her through. So here's the question. Was she right to separate the two, forgiving the child but not letting the man off the hook? Or after 6 weeks of traps and a public search, should she have made him earn every bit of it? Tell me in the comments, and I'll see you in the next story.